Hello and welcome to the American Compass podcast. My name is Oren Cass. I am executive director at American Compass, and I'm going to pause here for an air horn sound effect because this is Talkin Policy Shop with Policy Director Chris Griswold.
Yes, it is.
How are you doing, Chris?
I'm doing great. How are you today?
I am well. It is wonderful to see you. Talkin Policy Shop, of course, a very popular feature here on the American Compass podcast, and we are going big today with that biggest of policy topics for
Big
many.
swings.
Tax and budget.
Tax and budget.
I think they're really one and the same in many respects, though we should probably start there because that is something that I think for conservatives has been a challenge over time. Tax policy has become not so much the matter of how you raise enough revenue to pay for the government and more a matter of how you sell yet another tax cut as your plan for economic growth. Obviously, a tax cut was prominent in the Reaganomics of the 1980s. It's worth mentioning at that time, marginal tax rates were in the 70s for individual income, in the 40s and 50s for capital gains and corporate rates. And I think conservatives proudly feel that those tax reforms made a significant difference in the trajectory of the American economy at the time. The problem is that then George W. Bush, of course, comes along and his main plan, 2001, 2003, more tax cuts. Economic evidence, economists pretty much, I believe, across the political spectrum would acknowledge those did not deliver much in the way of economic progress and, in fact, set us off on a course of several decades of quite poor economic results. And then, of course, you have Donald Trump, whose one major legislative accomplishment is yet another set of tax cuts, which again did not deliver the promised economic oomph. Are you ready for another tax cut?
No, I don't think so. Because to your point, what we've been doing for 30 years is trying to rerun the playbook of the GOAT, right? Reagan was probably right to do what he did at the time. But as you said, that was a very, very different situation with a very different set of economic circumstances and a very different tax rate. Where you can't tax cut your way all the way ad infinitum and keep expecting economic growth to magically result. It doesn't work, and we've seen that. And we did a really, I think, quality collection of work called A Walk on the Supply Side a little while ago that outlines exactly this point. And you take us through the data and the evidence that demonstrate that the Bush tax cuts, the Trump tax cuts didn't deliver in terms of growth. It didn't deliver in terms of business investment, which is kind of the mechanism that is promised. If you get the burden of a high corporate tax rate off the backs of American business, then they'll invest more, produce more. That didn't happen. And there are a lot of reasons for that. And part of that package of material points out that what we really need is a different suite of policy interventions if you do want American businesses to actually start producing rather than making their profits through financial engineering. But what that means is that rerunning the playbook just isn't the way. It's pretty clear. And so we've run up against this wall in which I think a lot of Republican leaders are struggling to know what to say about taxes. And what you're pointing out, I think, is just the really basic distinction between economic policy and fiscal policy. We can't keep talking about tax cuts as our primary economic policy plan. We do need to talk about taxes as what they are, which is a revenue-raising mechanism, and be honest about that function of taxes.
Yeah, that's right. And so I think we'll spend most of the time on the fiscal question. I want to dive in a little bit on the economic point because, as you said, we did this collection called A Walk on the Supply Side, which we framed that way very intentionally because what was so unique about Reagan, and this, it was called the supply side revolution. What it actually represented was a shift from the Keynesian idea that if you want to boost the economy, you just got to get people to spend more money somehow. And what they said was, no, actually what really drives, progress, innovation, economic growth, productivity growth, therefore wage growth, and the virtuous cycle of economic growth is the supply side, is the actual investment by businesses in doing new things. And at that time, given where tax rates were, lowering those tax rates was an important mechanism for inducing that kind of investment. I think it's very important to say that American Compass, here at American Compass, we are hardcore supply siders.
The true supply siders.
The true supply siders, perhaps. which is to say that all we ever talk about is domestic investment and how you actually get more of that and the productivity growth. And so in that respect, I think we would say, conservatives need to continue pushing with exactly the economic thinking that they've had.
Yes.
The key point is to recognize that tax rates is only one such mechanism among many tools that one could pursue. It's not always going to be the right one. And also, it's not free. That is, it is both tax cuts are very expensive. Either you have to pay for them with something else, including public, you can cut back on public investment to do it, or you're going to have to borrow for it and basically crowd out private investment. And we'll come back to those dimensions of it. But it's also expensive in terms of political capital. If you make that your agenda, if you make that the thing you want Congress working on, you're not going to be doing anything else. And so I think, certainly American Compass's perspective is supply side is the critical place to focus.
Yes.
Taxes certainly matter. At the margin, lower rates are better than higher rates for what you want to be doing. But when you're asking what are the problems in the American economy in the 21st century, how do we tackle them? Hey, here's our next big tax cut, has not been in the genuine conservative tradition of developing policy in response to actual circumstances.
Yeah, and being prudential and wise and responsive to the realities of the moment. Exactly. And if we say, which I think you're exactly right, that Reagan was entirely correct to focus on the supply side, and conservatives still are. You've got to be honest about what the other constraints are that are preventing American business from doing the kind of productive activity we need. We have to talk about globalization. We have to talk about the kind of way that Wall Street has metastasized and drawn a lot of American capital into just financial engineering instead of production and innovation. Those are the real barriers that need to be addressed if the supply side is going to be unleashed in exactly the way that conservatives are correct to talk about.
Yeah, and there's an interesting corollary here, which is I think our approach to supply side policy follows in many ways from the insight that not all growth is created equal. That just because you are generating profits and generating top line GDP growth does not necessarily mean you've actually generated the kind of broad-based prosperity you're looking for. And one of the things typically that conservatives have really liked about the tax cut model is that it is so neutral, right? Everybody now has a lower tax rate. Whatever investment one might pursue now as a result is great and equal, and we're indifferent. I think one of the realities is you see, okay, well, if the things that have been most profitable and attracted the most capital in recent decades are not necessarily delivering the kinds of results we want, then tax cuts to encourage people to just do even more of that may in fact just get you more of that. And if you actually want to assert that policymakers, ultimately the American people, have a right and a need to say, well, actually there are some kinds of investment we care more about, then the broad-based, well, here's just a lower tax rate for everybody is just not responsive to that. Whereas some of the other policies that we talk about, and we won't dive into those here, but we refer you to everything else.
As much as we'd like to.
We refer you to everything else we've ever published are more effective.
I mean, Adam Smith taught us that you are allowed to distinguish between productive and unproductive activities in the market. Not all market activities are created the same. And this is encouraging, I think, that more and more conservatives in D.C., more policymakers are re-embracing not only their freedom to do that, but their obligation to make those distinctions that profit from offshoring American jobs, profit from letting private equity bankrupt a small town, big tech addicting your kids. I mean, the conservatives are leading on fighting back on big tech. I think we are now at this moment where we are allowed to say what you just said, which I find very encouraging.
Yeah, well, and actually, just really concrete example to your private equity point. I mean, we have just in the news recently, you see Elliott Management, Paul Singer's hedge fund, announcing they're taking a large position in Texas Instruments, trying to force it to generate more free cash. And so this is a perfect example, right? On one side, you have the CHIPS Act that says, actually, we think it's really important for Texas Instruments to invest in domestic semiconductor manufacturing capacity. On the other side, you have Paul Singer saying, actually, we think it's really important that you return as much free cash to investors as quickly as possible. A corporate tax cut rewards one of those behaviors The CHIPS Act rewards the other. And so I welcome people to argue for whichever one they think is more important for the American economy today, but that is what policymakers are facing.
We don't have to beat the dead horse any further, but just to make the point that that's not abstract. I mean, this is in fact what happened when the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act passed. A bunch of corporations in the U.S. enjoyed a windfall as a result. What did they do? They did a bunch of buybacks. They returned a bunch of money to their shareholders. They didn't reinvest it in productive activity like building chips, for example. So this is in fact what has happened. We have proof of concept in the case studies. This is the current dynamic.
That's a good point. And so that's what brings us then to this fiscal policy discussion, because you've had this phenomenon where conservatives have said, well, tax cuts are going to generate economic growth. Often they will, quote, pay for themselves. And therefore, we can have this tax discussion essentially independent of budget realities. I mean, in my mind, the most classic illustration of this is you have Paul Ryan, purportedly the fiscal conservative. What is his one major legislative accomplishment? A giant unfunded tax cut that raised the deficit by $1.7 trillion. Now, per the first part of our conversation, he would presumably tell you all the reasons he thought that was a good idea anyway. But the fact remains that has somehow qualified as, quote, fiscal conservatism, even though it is unfunded and empirically, both in the Bush cases and the Trump case, raised deficits and contributed to what is now a totally out of control deficit.
No, I think that's exactly right. I mean, whatever case you can make for that, the case that it pays for itself and will therefore help reduce the deficit or at least be deficit neutral is just mathematically false. Math is math, and that's not what happened.
And that's right. And so I think what you see at this point is, we have deficits approaching $2 trillion a year. And it's important to emphasize $2 trillion a year at what should be essentially the peak of a business cycle. I mean, we have very low unemployment. We are not in the middle of some crisis. We are not fighting a world war. And yet we still have a deficit of that size. And the accumulation of past deficits, which then drives our interest payments, coupled with the deficits we are looking at going forward, I think have really at this point broken through to the point where people, even those who in the past have wanted to be in more of a, quote, deficits don't matter position, are having to admit that, yes, actually deficits do matter. And they matter for a few different reasons.
No, and I think, and this is actually a huge point that really gets under my skin, is everyone in D.C. says they believe that deficits matter. What they actually do doesn't seem to reflect that on both sides of the aisle, and we should get into that, of kind of the false and bankrupt talking points on both sides of the aisle that pay lip service to this but then don't fix it. If the fact is that we don't actually fix this, it seems to me that maybe people don't actually genuinely believe that the deficit is a big deal. So I'm glad you raised this, because I think it's extremely important to be clear that it is a big deal. In fact, it's potentially an existential deal, and to just be clear about that. Because if whatever solution is required is going to be painful, which it will be to some extent, we have to be clear about why that's worth doing versus what we've been doing now, which is this lip service versus actual action. The thing that concerns me the most is just the scale of interest payments. I mean, if we stay on the current course, interest payments on our national debt will be the largest line item in the federal budget in 25 years. We are headed there very quickly. And that just strikes me as fundamentally unsustainable. You can't do that. And just for the practical reason, if nothing else, is that you got to spend that on other stuff. There's all kinds of important priorities that will suffer as a result of that. Our capacity to borrow further in case of emergency is compromised by that. Our fiscal capacity to respond to a pandemic or to a world war or whatever is badly damaged by that. I just don't see how a scenario in which our largest budget line item is the interest payment is I don't see how anyone justifies that. And I think that's the kind of thing you'll hear conservatives say, but I think it's important to just put a period at the end of that sentence and make clear just how existentially threatening that is to the viability of the American economy and, frankly, national security as well.
Well, and I mean, it's important to say already, I believe this year is the first year interest payments will exceed defense spending.
Yes.
I mean, we are up to $1 trillion a year, give or take, in interest payments, which, one thing it's important to recognize is that means that even if we, quote, balance the budget, meaning we actually were raising enough revenue to pay for the things we were actually getting as Americans, we would still have $1 trillion deficit. And it's those are actual essentially resources that we are having to take from the American people and commit to the holders of our debt, essentially as a thank you for the past deficits that we have run. And every deficit we continue to run imposes more of those burdens down the line. And so I do think to your point about people say they care, but they don't do anything about it. There's also a very clear incentive problem, which is the problems they are creating are going to be borne by somebody else. And that sort imposing accountability in those circumstances can be very difficult. And so I think that's one reason it's actually really important to highlight the other implication of the deficit and the damage it does in the moment, which is that if you are essentially borrowing $2 trillion and basically then turning around and mailing it out to people, which is essentially what drives our deficit, that is money that cannot be invested in anything else. And this is actually a really key point in the economic literature. Sorry, I'm drifting back to point one on the economic policy. But one of the key implications for why tax cuts don't necessarily work as economic growth is if you have to borrow to fund them. So in other words, if you give a tax cut to say, great, now go invest, but then turn around and suck money from investors to pay for the tax cut, well, what are we really doing here? And there are sort of two places it can come from. One is you can say, look, money that otherwise would have been invested in the United States is instead being invested in buying treasury bonds. And that is a real problem. A lot of the right of center tax models will reject that claim. They will say, in fact, we can borrow money for free because we have the rest of the world to borrow it from, which on one hand, true, at least to some extent. On the other hand, what does that show up as? That shows up as our trade deficit.
Right, and we should talk about that. I mean, because I think if I recall, Japan is the largest holder of U.S. debt, of U.S. treasuries, but China is the second largest. It's something like $900 billion or something like that. China is not our friend, and there's just a very straightforward, I think, security question of allowing a adversary or potential hostile power to hold that much of our debt. And we've written a lot about that at American Compass, the danger of that on its own, but also what it reflects, which is our addiction to cheap imports that we purchase not by trading our own goods back, but by buying them with deficit-financed funds. And that results in this kind of double dependency where a country like China holds a lot of our debt and is also left in control of a lot of our critical supply chains that we helped them build by sending them all of our assets, and so you have this long-term challenge in which we are essentially financing the degradation of our own industrial base, and leaving ourselves in this indebted position to countries like China, which is not sustainable.
Yeah, well, and that's an important point about the hollowing out of the industrial base, because you're also essentially in this vicious cycle where the more you borrow essentially globally, which means a trade deficit, and you therefore hollow out domestic economic capacity, you then in fact weaken your ability to fund yourself going forward.
Yes.
And by the way, you end up giving the corporate tax cut to people who are investing and earning their money elsewhere.
Yeah.
But I think one way this sort of comes home to roost for me is it's sometimes you'll hear people say trade deficits are okay because they'll say, well, you run a trade deficit with the grocery store. And there are many reasons this is an extremely stupid point. We try to
we try
to stay away from things like extremely stupid. This is a family-friendly podcast, but I'm going to go ahead and say This one is extremely
We'll bleep
stupid.
it out in post.
I appreciate that. Somewhat unwise. Here's the problem. You may run a trade deficit with the grocery store, but you run an awfully big trade surplus with your employer. If you're running a trade deficit with everybody on net with everybody else, well, we call that somebody who's sort of running up credit card debt. And there's the long-term problem with running up credit card debt. There's also the short-term problem that if you decide, well, you don't have to work as much or progress in your career or increase your own earning potential because, well, you're just funding your consumption with this credit card debt, you're actively making yourself worse off in the process, even as you raise your future liabilities. And that is effectively what the United States has done. Warren Buffett, it was back in about 2003, in the process of essentially proposing a global tariff, described exactly this process as we were basically selling off pieces of the family farm.
Yes, that's exactly it.
And so I think this is the sort of immediate problem is, we tend to talk in terms of the trade deficit first and foremost because we're concerned about that domestic productive capacity. One of the things you'll hear in response, which I will say is not extremely stupid because it is at least descriptively accurate, is, well, a trade deficit is just the flip side of the savings imbalance, that the reason we run the trade deficit, in effect, is because we are soaking up all of this outside money essentially to fund our budget deficit. To which I say, I accept your terms. Yes. That is indeed a reason why we need to be concerned about this deficit and say if the government is going to be behaving this way, one of the knock-on effects today, not long in the future, is going to be that you're actively hobbling essentially your own economic capacity.
All right. So if deficits matter because of our interest payments, because of crowding out private investment, because of the relationship between the trade deficit and the budget deficit, where does that leave us, Soren? Tell us.
So we've just put out two really interesting things that I think speak to this in a really complementary manner. One is some really interesting public opinion survey data on what Americans would say to do about it. And we did something that I think it's I've never seen the question asked this way. I mean, we asked people, do they care? And, unsurprisingly, to your point in like the abstract rhetorical terms, like everyone says like, yes, I do care. But we said, okay, if you care, let's say you were sort of king of the world and could allocate how you're going to solve this problem through tax increases versus spending cuts. How would you do it? Here's your 100 points. How much is tax increases? How much is spending cuts? And got back a lot of really interesting data on how Americans across the political spectrum would like to see us approach the problem. So that's one half of it that we can dive into. The other half is we did our own budget model. And I think importantly, we tried to stay away from the standard Washington approach of, ta-da, here's our king of the world thing that magically balances in 10 years with a set of totally implausible assumptions that nobody would ever actually allow to happen. And you see this on both sides of the political spectrum. You see this with the Biden White House budget, which is like, in fact, over the next 10 years, let's continue increasing spending. No, we don't actually really want to increase taxes. And so we still have a $2 trillion deficit with even higher spending 10 years from now. And you see this on the Republican side. You see, Heritage Foundation put out a budget recently. I think there's a lot of really good and interesting stuff in there. But at the end of the day, they get to, quote, balance by cutting Medicare roughly in half. And it's like, first of all, I don't think that would be especially wise, but also no politician anywhere on the spectrum, nor any American voter anywhere on the spectrum has any interest in doing this. So I'm not sure what it really contributes to the conversation.
Well, and speaking of things that are very stupid, I think that the 10-year budget window exercise, I think we could put in the category of like deeply unhelpful as a way that Washington thinks about these questions. But I think the point to me that strikes most deeply is just the way in which both parties kind of wish the realities of politics away. Where like, no, actually, the public will not tolerate cuts to Social Security or to Medicare or what have you. That is not a plausible path. Nor on the left is it a plausible path to keep spending on things that turns out aren't actually all that popular and which the Democrats are currently paying for politically right now. And also in conversation with each other, I think there's a lack of honesty that if you can't get there just by kind of ignoring away the problem and spending what you want, or by these kind of ultimately fictional and notional deep cuts that will get you there mathematically, but have no plausibility, it means you're going to have to talk to each other at some point and come to some actual kind of agreement that involves both raising revenue and cutting spending, which is a violation of the orthodoxies on both sides of the aisle. But that's really, I think, where the model we released points us to. The kind of inexorable inevitability of math points you to this simple reality that some kind of like a deal has to be struck.
Yeah, no, that's right. And so, I guess we should say the other thing that sometimes you'll see done with budget models on the right is we'll just say, oh, and by the way, we're in fact going to cut taxes more, but that's going to generate so much growth, and that growth is going to generate so much more tax revenue that in fact we're all going to be richer than ever. And it's like,
to reference earlier in this conversation, is not actually empirically what happens when you cut taxes.
And to be clear, it's not how, even if you thought that were true, it's not actually how a responsible person would behave. That is, that especially at this point, given recent history, the sequence is certainly for a conservative should be essentially, look, you have to earn your tax cut in a sense, right? Or if you're a Democrat who says like, oh, we're going to do all these things that are going to sort of, they have their own narrative of sort of how the spending pays for itself, right? Like this early childhood program is going to repay itself 10 times over this or that. Yeah. At some point you have to say like, you guys have been saying that for so long and we simply do not believe you anymore, right? It's sort of like, what would you say to your 30-year-old kid who like comes back and says like, no, like this time I'm really gonna, get together. At some point you say like, no, let's turn this around. Let's see you actually get it together. And if you can, then yes, then yes, it would be great to bring taxes down. Then yes, it would be great to do that program. But you only earn the right to do that by displaying the fiscal responsibility to begin with.
Well, and the other thing I think that you see like the very serious people in D.C. doing is proposing to make it someone else's problem through like a blue ribbon commission or so, and just hand off that set of responsibilities to make those trade-offs to some other body of people because politicians don't want to do it themselves. And that too hasn't really seemed to work either.
Yeah.
So helpfully, we at American Compass have gone ahead and done it for you. And that's what this model allows us to play with, is this, like, all right, let's model out the different kinds of scenarios you might consider.
Yeah, that's right. And so we basically took CBO scores for everything and we just presented it all and say, look, here are the actual sort of options on the table, and looked at a couple of scenarios. Like, let's look at the kind of stuff that actually seems at least hypothetically plausible that, Republicans could put forth seriously on the spending side with some expectation of support that the Democrats might credibly advance as revenue raisers, and see where you get what that gets you. And then let's put together an aggressive scenario that shows you how much you would actually have to check off to get to that sort of bringing things back into balance. And I think we'll sort of, other people can play with it too. We'll add more policy options to it over time. It's a living document, as they say. And I'm sure we can improve it in all sorts of ways, but I think it has that advantage over what most of the budget work out there in Washington looks like, of actually being intended to help find ways forward rather than being intended to deliver talking points that preclude any actual progress.
And to obfuscate the reality of the trade-offs that will need to be made. That's I think the difference. That's what I find most striking about our model is that distinction. That it's trying to smuggle in these assumptions that don't reflect reality. It's trying to expose the actual truth of the matter, which is a bit more painful.
And so we put some analysis with it that sort of draws our conclusions from it. I think the key thing that you see, and you'll hear us talking a lot in terms of kind of, what is spending or revenue as a percent of GDP. And that's typically how people think about the budget. It allows for apples to apples comparison over time. It acknowledges that, revenue typically is going with a given tax structure, revenue will grow as the economy grows. And generally speaking, spending also grows as the economy grows for, it's actually a more complicated set of reasons, but in fact tends to be the case. And, so right now we have this massive deficit. Revenue is, 17.5% of GDP. We are spending up close to 24% of GDP. And importantly, that is a post-pandemic phenomenon. We historically would be closer to 20. Spending went way up during the pandemic, has
not come back.
come nearly all the way back down. And so you look at that and you say, okay, well, what is a plausible path forward? What we find just sort of clicking all the options is, realistically, you can make out a path to get down back below 20% of GDP in spending. It's awfully hard to figure out how you're going to get lower than that. And certainly no actual plausible Republican spending proposals get you down much lower than that. The interesting thing about that figure is how it connects to many other such exercises over time. I mean, if you look at when, Clinton and Gingrich did balance the budget 25 years ago, it was right around there, 90% of GDP. If you look at Paul Ryan's Path to Prosperity budget in 2013, what did he envision as the fiscally responsible scenario in the 2030s? It was both revenue and spending around 19% of GDP. And so I think there are a lot of sort of forces pushing in that direction. Russ Vogt at the Center for Renewing America, who is OMB director for Trump, has put out a very thorough budget. I take issue with some of those assumptions he makes around we're going to get extra tax revenue, extra growth. If you take that out and assume the spending he thinks you can get down to with the economy what it would otherwise be, he also ends up at about 19% of GDP. And so I think as just sort of a mental framework, thinking about from where we are today, certainly that means most of the deficit reduction is going to have to come from, should come from spending cuts, getting back to where we used to be, as opposed to, mostly coming from tax increases, the way that you might hear Democrats talk about it. But I think it sort of, it parameterizes the problem, as people say. And I think it's just really interesting to see how closely then, the American people somehow in their wisdom of the crowd way come to a similar place.
This was very, very striking. So we asked the folks, taking our survey that we polled to weight how they would solve the problem, with a mix of tax cuts or tax increases or spending cuts. And just see what happened. And it turns out that the median American wants a mix that is weighted a bit more to spending cuts than to raising taxes, but it's about 40% tax revenues, 60% spending cuts, which is more or less exactly what we modeled out and what all these other scenarios you've talked about also point to. And it's utterly striking. And the other thing that's striking to me is that if you break that down by party, there's some predictable difference. Republicans are interested in, say, like 25% tax revenue, 75% spending cuts. Dems, it's 50-50. But those are not that far apart. Those are, in fact, like remarkably close to each other. And especially in my mind, on the Republican side, the clear openness and even desire for a reasonable place for tax revenue. Like the public, including the conservative public, is much more realistic about this than I think folks in DC tend to be.
Well, and I think that goes for both sides. That, the interesting thing, because of the way we ask the question, rather than just have like, strongly agree, somewhat agree, whatever, you basically draw a distribution curve. Like you get that bell curve for each set of Americans by partisan leaning of how extreme their positions are in various ways. And so it's not just that the median Republican says 25% tax increases, 75% spending cuts. First of all, that tells you that half of Republicans want more than 25% or more in tax increases. But it's also how small the tail is, that the share of Republicans who actually share the black letter position, there shall never be tax increases ever, is somewhere like 15%. I mean, obviously that is a cohort, but that is not even where the base of the party is. Democrats is even more extreme. The share of Democrats out there who are saying, I want to close this deficit through tax increases, don't cut spending, it's like 2% or something.
No,
I mean, this is just...
That 50-50 number is wild. You're telling me the kind of median Democrat wants like 50% of deficit reduction to come from spending cuts. It's just not where the National Democratic Party is like at all.
That's right. And so I think it sort of inverts this picture we typically have of our politics where, oh, you know, we have these people in Washington who like maybe they would be reasonable if they could be, but you got to be responsive to those voters. And it actually looks exactly like the opposite. You have these very reasonable seeming voters who are like looking to their fringes at what their elected officials are saying. And you know, the one other thing I've just found very striking doing this project generally that connects to this point is that the sort of like very wise pundits think that they should be making these points about how like, well, like in a democracy with these incentives, like obviously you can, you know, how would you ever solve these problems or balance this budget? In fact, the history of the United States is exactly the opposite. I mean, for the first 225 years of our democratic republic, we lived almost entirely with our means. You know, we got to, you know, almost the first 100 years up until the Civil War actually running a small surplus. Score one for tariffs. You know, obviously there were then, as we've talked about, there are times when you do encounter a lot of costs, whether it is a Civil War, World War I, Great Depression, World War II. But what you see is those periods of really increased spending and debt accumulation followed by long periods of surplus or very small deficits below GDP growth that bring that debt way back down. And so, you know, even after the Reagan military buildup and very high deficit spending, you still get to the late 1990s and can still balance the budget. And in 2000, you know, our publicly held debt was less than a third of GDP. So the idea that somehow democratic politics or the American people or any of this is incompatible with fiscal responsibility is just untrue. There is something very defective about the way the leadership of the Republican and Democratic parties have approached this only in the last 20 to 25 years that are the source of this crisis.
And in a political moment, I think, in which both parties are competing for working class votes, very openly trying to own the mantle of the party of the working class. If you break down these numbers not by party but by class, the working class is like right in the middle of like exactly the most reasonable, like their 30-70 tax cuts, tax revenue and spending cuts. And so if your concern in kind of the short-term political sense is the public will not permit this, public seems actually quite open to this, including the working class public, which you are specifically targeting in an election year. They may not think what you think they think on these questions and may be much more responsive to a reasonable argument than I think a lot of the pundits in D.C. seem to be afraid that they will.
Yeah, I certainly agree with that. And so I think we should wrap up with a little bit of a sort of so what, right? Like usually the American Compass podcast is just, or certainly here on Talkin Policy Shop, just 45 minutes of proposals. Here we've been focused very much on just sort of how do you think about this? You know, what are the key dynamics in these debates? What has gone off the rails? I think when you get to, okay, so what does this mean for how policymakers should approach these things? It seems to me there are a couple of key insights. One is that the correct way to move forward is not with, look at my extremist balanced budget that no one will ever accept. No, look at my extremist balanced budget that no one will accept. Nor is it, let's do a grand bargain or a blue ribbon commission that solves the problem in 2060. It's how do we actually build, frankly, some credibility with the American people and some trust between the parties that both sides want to do anything about this at all. Because if you talk based on the last 20 to 25 years, you talk to a Democrat and you say, you know, look, we really do need to get serious now about some spending cuts. What they will say is, we're not going to talk about spending cuts. That's just going to get turned into funding for the next tax cut. You talk to a Republican about, you know, we actually do need to raise some revenue here. They're going to say, we're not going to raise any revenue. The Democrats are just going to use that to justify even more spending. And it's sort of this, you can understand why both sides think that. it's also one of these things where, like, as the third party looking at the, the couple bickering, you can be like, I really do see another way out of this one, guys.
Here on the American Compass Marriage Counseling
That's right.
podcast,
that would be another fantastic feature we should roll out. The next step here isn't therefore like we're all going to sign up for $20 trillion of entitlement whatevers. It's like, could you guys actually get together and agree on some significant cuts that start to bring us back down to that 2019 level of spending? And by all means, start with the lowest hanging fruit. Can you get together on somewhere where you've probably brought taxes down further than they can reasonably be brought? And you start to see this even now with some Republicans saying like, hey guys, corporate tax rate, we're not really sure why we went all the way down to 21.
No, but this is super important, I think, because if what you're talking about is building trust, which happens when someone makes a modest bid that someone else accepts and then you build from there. Right now, it's Republican leaders who are showing the most openness to that conversation, and Democrats don't seem to be showing any interest at all. You've got House Budget Chairman Jody Arrington saying this openly, like, hey, any reasonable conversation about fiscal responsibility is going to have all options on the table, including raising revenue in some responsible and reasonable way. Members like Congressman Chip Roy have said similar things. That is an offer, conversational offer on the table. And I think it's telling and remarkable that no serious Democrat seems interested in responding to that. But I find that quite hopeful.
Yeah.
That these leaders are going there.
And I think, and that gets exactly what my second takeaway on all this is, which is, and it goes also to your point about, where the working class is and some of the realignment that has gone on in our politics. I think the ideal is that you actually do find good faith partners on both sides who start to work on some of this and just show that you can make progress in both directions, and that you are not just going to be taken advantage of by the other side, in part with the backstop that is not what voters are looking for in either direction. To the extent that that's not happening, it seems to me there's actually a huge opportunity for conservatives here to really claim the middle ground that is where most American voters are. And, to your point, I've seen this also in if you start to have a conversation with a Democrat about some of these challenges and you just say like, yes, I agree there's a revenue problem. Do you agree there's a spending problem? And they say no. And then you say like, okay, well, like there's literally no way to support your position with any plausible, they'll come back and say, well, like the Bush tax cut was too big. And you say like, okay, well, that's not really responsive. And like, I agree the Bush tax cut was too big.
But it's not going to get you there. There's like this mathematical implausibility. Like you can soak the rich as much as you want. That alone isn't going to get you to a fiscally responsible place. That's just not the politics of it aside. Just the math of it doesn't work.
Yeah, that's right. And not to mention, by the way, that increasingly those constituencies that Democrats have historically said they want to raise taxes on, the highest income voters, corporations, are increasingly the core of the Democratic coalition.
Yes.
Likewise, historically, if you ask Democrats for spending cuts, they'll say, like, well, let's cut defense. But now Democrats have become the party of expansive and growing global defense commitments. And so it seems to me that there are two breakthroughs to this logjam. One is people get serious. The other is, should we not all wish to just rely on the good faith and intentions of everybody else and the kindness of strangers, is that there is a real opportunity for conservatives here not to suddenly become the tax increasing party, because I think nobody here is saying like high taxes are good. The goal is ideally taxes are as low as possible, but to say actually we are the party that's serious about this, that has the same position as most American voters on this, are willing to make commitments on both sides of it, and are sort of just looking for a partner to do that. And whereas there was a time when everybody thought like, well, we're just going to come out with another tax cut was the winning position. Certainly that is not the winning position in the what is good for America sense. It's not clear at this point that that is even the politically advantageous place to go.
No, and there's not to wax philosophical here at the end of the pod, but
What else would the end of the pod be for? We're going to wrap up with Chris's philosophical waxing.
As Aristotle said, no. I think, and this isn't in the survey, this is just my thoughts, but that it seems to me the American public and the working class intuitively understand the moral importance of a sense of obligation to one another, to the nation, to the future of us as a nation. And the party or leaders that can articulate that, I think will find a receptive audience. And this is, at the end of the day, really what we're talking about, which is not mortgaging away the future of our children and of our nation, and thinking in terms of that continuity, that our obligations are not just to our own best interests right now, but also to the best interests of our countrymen and to our shared future. I think as much as that can sound like a message of shared sacrifice, I think that's actually what the public understands to be morally correct. And I think the leaders that are willing to communicate that clearly and then backed up by a reasonable, actually responsible set of ideas on the policy side, I think are likely to find a response, a positive response.
We will leave it there. Mr. Griswold, pleasure as always.
As always.
We will be back soon with another episode of the American Compass Podcast.